This discussion is essentially the history of evolutionary thought, or the history of the theory of evolution. And if we look at this timeline here, back in the day, Carolus Linnaeus and his system of classification, where we could actually see that there are organisms that look alike and are different, and they're alike for certain reasons. Hutton, who said that the Earth actually has been changing gradually over time. Lamarck, who said species can change, but his idea of evolution was a little different, as we'll see. Through Malthus and Cuvier with fossils, the finding of fossils in the early 1800s, some modern geology thoughts by Charles Lyell, and then of course came Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin lived in the mid-1800s and published The Origin of Species, on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. So on Lamarck thought that species evolved through use and disuse. So they would change through use and disuse. So a quick example of that would be a giraffe. His theory that was if a giraffe had longer necks because they had been stretching for so many years to reach the leaves of the acacia trees. And so that the longer they would keep stretching their neck out, stretching their neck out, stretching their neck out, and so when they had babies, their babies would have longer necks. If this were true, then if your dad's a bodybuilder, you'd have a lot of muscles. And of course, this doesn't really happen. Then came Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin took a trip to the Galapagos Islands, actually took a trip around the world, and when he was in the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there are some very similar bird species on the island. They were all finches, but the finches had all evolved or had all changed. Their adaptations were different. There were finches that had sharp beaks, like this one. There were finches that had very narrow pointed beaks, and they would grasp insects. And there were finches that had big, thick beaks to break open big seeds. Even though they looked very similar, they were very similar in size in a lot of ways. They were different. And he wondered why on this island, in the middle of nowhere, the Galapagos Islands, 300 miles off the coast of Ecuador in the Pacific Ocean, would there be such differences between finches? And in the rest of his trip, and you can read about it in your textbook, or any pretty much biology textbook has a history of Darwin's trip around the world, he had noticed that about a lot of other things, and he made some observations. And he wrote it, and this is a little bit of a history lesson on when he did The Origin of Species. It was actually kind of a race with another guy who had the same kind of theory, Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin became famous. Wallace did not, but it easily could have been Wallace's theory of evolution. And he would be the very, very famous person instead of Darwin. Darwin just happened to get it to print first. So, a guy named Ernst Mayr is an evolutionary biologist, and he has kind of taken Darwin's theory and he's taken Darwin's 5 observations that he wrote down and made it into 3 inferences. Observation 1, for any species, population sizes would increase exponentially if all individuals reproduce successfully. So for example, if you look at this maple here, or box elder here, look at all the seeds that are produced by this box elder tree. So now think if every one of those seeds became a tree, we would be inundated with box elder trees. If every rabbit that was ever born became an adult, we would be inundated and then had their own kids. We'd have so many rabbits we wouldn't know what to do with them. Observation number 2, there are seasonal fluctuations in size, but populations tend to stay the same. They don't grow exponentially. Observation number 3 that Darwin made, that, okay, So what's the limiting factor on populations? Well, we talk about this in ecology in freshman year. Resources are generally the limiting factor. So the inference Meyer made is that if you have more individuals than the environment can support, you get a struggle for existence, and only some survive. Observation number 4, there's a lot of differences in members of a population. Look around the room, and only 12 people here, we have a lot of varying characteristics. Okay? And if you look at these ladybird beetles, also known as ladybugs, you say, well, they all look the same. Well, not really. This one has 3 white spots on its head, and this one has 2. This one has a different white spot right here. There are spots on their shells. Look at it. We have some black ones in here. Okay, so they vary quite a bit, even though, I mean, to you and me, all ladybird beetles look alike. They actually aren't. And his 5th observation is that much of this variation is heritable or able to be inherited. So, what does that leave us with? Well, survival then must in part depend on inherited traits. Individuals whose inherited traits give them a high probability of surviving and reproducing are likely to leave more offspring than other individuals. What do we call that? Survival of the fittest. Okay? Survival of the fittest. The ones that are more fit for their environment, they're going to survive longer and reproduce more than others. Well, that makes sense. Okay? And so the basis of Darwin's theory of natural selection is right there. That's what natural selection is. Okay? So, if the unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to a gradual change in a population with favorable characteristics accumulating over generations. Okay, so the idea here is that a person born with half a leg is not likely to pass that on to their offspring. Well, nowadays, maybe more than before. Okay, but if you think back 300 years ago, or let's make it even better, a dog with half a leg, genetically born with half a leg, is not likely to survive and have babies because can't get food and a lot of other reasons. So some support then for Darwin's theory, for this theory, and the first support comes from the idea of artificial selection, that we have been able to modify species over generations. We have been able to select and breed individuals with desired traits. Here's an example I like to use. Wild mustard plant grows pretty much ubiquitous, means it grows everywhere around here. Humans have genetically engineered this by taking certain favorable characteristics. The flower clusters, the white flower clusters, they've taken those and bred plants with whiter flower clusters to make cauliflower. The terminal bud, that's the bud at the end of the stem, cabbage. The lateral buds, it forms these buds on the side, Brussels sprouts. Leaves make kale. Stem to make something called kohlrabi, and the flowers and stems to make broccoli. And we've all had, well, for sure we've probably all had this, this, and this. I'm not sure if you eat Brussels sprouts or not. I don't. And so they're pretty bitter. I'm not sure what the deal is there. But they're all actually, their ancestor is wild mustard. So a summary of natural selection, and you can stop and read this if you want. Pause this and read it. Natural selection is differential succession reproduction from varying with individuals that vary in heritable traits. So they look different, and their environment. So one of the key ideas of natural selection is that if an environment changes over time, you may get adaptation to the new conditions. You may get a different kind of organism based on the environment. Here's a couple examples of that idea. If you, there's 2 kinds of mantids here. The orchid mantid, which I think is right here. It's very difficult to tell by looking at it. And the very cool walking stick, or it's not a walking stick at all, it's a stick mantid. Look at the praying mantis there that's brown to match its environment. Okay, and how did it get that way? Well, theoretically, differential reproductive success. The ones that were browner and looked more like the sticks survived and lived longer. Here are some other hypotheses. There's a couple experiments that were done that you can read about in your text. Okay, when they put guppies in the pike cichlid pool, they prey mainly on large guppies, so the guppies would be smaller when they reproduce. In the pool where the predator is a killifish, they eat mainly small guppies. The guppies would be larger at sexual maturity. In other words, the bigger guppies would be the ones that would survive and reproduce. Second one, so here's a graph of the same idea. Okay, the control population was the guppies in the pools with pike cichlids. Okay, and you can see that the mass of them is higher in the females than the males than in the experimental population. Another example that's given is the drug resistance to HIV's resistance to drugs. Okay, and that these are the percent of HIV, percent of in their body of HIV resistant to the drug. Okay, and here are 3 different patients, and look at how at the beginning almost no viruses are resistant to the drug, but some are, and by 2.5 to 3 weeks, and especially by 7 weeks, every patient, 100% of the virus inside of them are resistant to that drug. This is why HIV drugs you have to cycle them to take different ones all the time. Then some supports for the theory of evolution based on things we see. Homology. Homology is similarities. Okay, for example, here are 4 mammal limbs. Okay, humerus, radius, ulna, phalanges, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Same here. Same here in a whale, same in a bat. They just look different based on how they're structured. Embryological similarities, that a chick embryo looks very much like a human embryo. Okay, evidence that we didn't necessarily evolve from birds, but if there was a common animal ancestor, that we all have developed differently genetically since then. We can look at percent of amino acids that are identical to the amino acids in a human hemoglobin protein, polypeptide, before it's a protein, before it's folded. And you see that a rhesus monkey, 95%, a mouse, 87%, this is a mammal, of course, a bird, 69%, a frog, and then a lamprey, which is a fish, but it's a very primitive fish, only 14%. And so we could say that, well, I mean, obviously by looking at us, we're more closely related to a monkey than a mouse, but also by looking at our proteins, we're more similar to a monkey than a mouse. The other, Darwin's observations of biogeography, how species are distributed, was kind of an important part. And for example, in Australia, there's a animal called the sugar glider. It's related to kangaroos. It's a marsupial. Okay, and it jumps off trees and flies through the air. In North America, we have a mammal, a rodent, just like it, the flying squirrel. So this is 2 animals, a marsupial, so it's got a pouch, and it's obviously very different from a mammal. It's different from a squirrel, okay, which gives birth to live young, and yet they have the same adaptations, even though they're in different places, and they're different organisms. We'll come back to that later. And then, of course, the fossil record. For example, if you look at some old fossils of old sea-dwelling organisms, this has a fluke, so it's probably a sea-dwelling mammal, and we find evidence that they actually had leg bones in their fins. Okay, just an example of some fossils that may support the theory of evolution. So that, in a nutshell, is the history and then some supports for Darwin's theory of natural selection.